In the following two videos, the superego formation in Freud's psychoanalytical theory will be illustrated. Since Freud defined the superego as the heir to the Oedipus complex, the nature of this complex will be also briefly mentioned. Let's start from this main concept of Freudian theory. In Freud's formulation, the Oedipus complex is related to the phallic phase, which is schematically the period from 3 to 5 years of age. It describes the child's conflicts that originate from the ambivalence he or she feels towards his or her parents, namely love and hate directed towards the same person. This ambivalence results from the original human bisexuality experienced in a triangular relationship, which is formed by mother, father, and child. In Freud's theory, prior to the triangular structure of the Oedipus, there is a purely dual relationship whose conflicts have nothing to do with rivalry towards a third party. According to the complete Oedipus complex, a boy chooses his mother as a love object and at the same time behaves like a little girl, showing a feminine and tender attitude towards his father. This feminine attitude, promoted by homosexual tendencies, leads him to experience ambivalent feelings of love and hostile jealousy towards both his parents. A girl goes through the same situation with opposite features, although her Oedipus complex develops differently than a boy's. The description of the complete Oedipus complex allows Freud to explain the ambivalence towards the parents by the interaction of the heterosexual and homosexual components, and not as the simple result of a situation of rivalry. This complex cannot be reduced to a real situation, namely to the influence effectively exerted on a child by the parental couple. Its effectiveness comes from the installation in the psychic apparatus of a prohibitive instance which forbids incest and shuts the door to the naturally sought-after satisfaction, uniting desire and law in an inseparable way. The way in which each individual either resolves or does not resolve the conflict of ambivalence towards their parents determines the psychopathological outcome. The transition through the Oedipus complex results in the installation of the superego in the psyche, where feminine and masculine traits taken from both parents are also established. As in the case of the formation of the ego structure, the influences that originate the superego are both internal and external. According to the former, it is possible to conceive the development of the superego as a result of a double-sided process. It consists on the one side of the incorporation of the first object identifications of the id, and on the other side of an energetic reaction against these incestuous object choices. From the viewpoint of the internal influences, it is possible to define the superego as a reactive formation, which is consequent to a primal repression and keeps the Oedipus complex repressed through anti-cathexis. However, there is a radical difference between the primal repression of the Oedipus complex and the other primal repressions illustrated in the previous videos. The other organic primal repressions impose the abandonment of the pre-genital goals and the prevalence of new ones, which, however, continue to invest the same primal objects. In contrast, in the case of the Oedipus complex, the primal repression implies the resignation of the parents cathected by sexual drives, the mourning of these losses, and the replacement of these objects through identificatory processes which lead to the rising of the superego within the apparatus. The primary repression of the Oedipus complex doesn't preserve in the unconscious what is repressed. It implies the dissolution or disintegration of the complex. What is repressed and conserved without dissolution can be a source of pathology if it is reactivated in the future. The primal repression of the Oedipus complex is carried out by the ego on the basis of the incorporation of the father or parents belonging to phylogeny, and not to individual history. This incorporation, which has oral cannibalistic features, takes place earlier than any object cathexis through a process of introjection, and leads to a first direct and immediate identification with the father or parents of the subject's personal prehistory. After Freud's death, this process was called primal identification, while the term introjection was first coined in psychoanalysis by Freud's disciple, Sandor Ferenczi. With regard to the external influences, the superego originates as an identificatory outcome of the abandoned object choices which belong to the phallic phase and are thus related to the Oedipus complex. This identification with the parents, which follows and reinforces the first one, leads to the establishment of a gradient within the ego. Freud first defined this gradient as ego ideal, which later, in his work The Ego and the Id, appeared as an equivalent of the superego. So, there are two main factors that contribute to the formation of the superego. The first one is internal, such as the intrinsic impossibility of the fulfillment of the Oedipal wishes due to the onset of the primal repression. Freud wrote that the Oedipus complex must collapse because the time has come for its disintegration, just as the milk teeth fall out when the permanent ones begin to grow. Although the majority of human beings go through the Oedipus complex as an individual experience, it is nevertheless a phenomenon which is determined and laid down by heredity, and which is bound to pass away according to program when the next preordained phase of development sets in. The second one is external and has to do with the intervention in the repression of the Oedipus complex of the influence of parental authority, which frustrates the child's wishes through education, religion, teaching, and reading. Once the cathexis related to the external parents are abandoned, the parental authority is introjected and a further identification with the parental mandate takes place. The internal influences. Primal identification is described by Freud as an archaic object relation that precedes the object choice. In order to understand this idea, it is necessary to remember that the superego has its roots in the phylogenetic inheritance of the id. Therefore, when Freud wrote that the ego draws from the id the strength of its superego, he implied that the ego brings back to life countless experiences which have sedimented in the id over generations. The ego identifies with objects, such as the father or parents of the personal prehistory, which belong to phylogeny and function as models in the process of anthropogenesis. However, the superego is not just a residue of the first object choices of the id. It is also an energetic reactive formation in opposition to them. For this reason, it has a double face that derives from the fact that its bond with the ego is not restricted to the warning. So, like the father, you must be. But it also includes the prohibition. So, like the father, you are not allowed to be. That is, you cannot do everything he does, as many things are reserved only for him. As a result, the superego was committed to the repression of the Oedipus complex and owes its genesis to this subversive impulse. The superego preserves this double face in its structure, as it contains a component related to the subject's ideals and another one related to its prohibitions. Both these components belong to the superego-ego ideal system. Therefore, the superego appears as a global structure that includes different functions: a moral conscience, an ideal function, and a constant self-observation. This self-observation is aimed at measuring, evaluating, and criticizing the ego's distance from ideal goals and its deviation from the moral standards imposed by the superego.